Europe in 1618 was a continent sitting on a powder keg. Kings prayed for peace, but prepared for war. Empires claimed divine authority, but ruled through fear. Religion, power, and ambition were no longer separate forces. They were fused into a single explosive conflict. And in the heart of Europe, the fuse was already burning. What began as a local rebellion in a distant kingdom would spiral into one of the most devastating wars in human history. A war that would redraw borders, shatter empires, and kill millions. This was not just a war between nations. It was a war for the soul of Europe. The roots of the 30 Years' War stretched back nearly a century before the first shot was fired. In 1517, Martin Luther challenged the authority of the Catholic Church, igniting the Protestant Reformation. Europe fractured along religious lines. Some rulers embraced Protestantism. Others defended Catholic dominance with increasing aggression. These divisions were not just spiritual. They became political weapons. Kings used religion to justify expansion, suppress rivals, and mobilize armies. The Holy Roman Empire, a loose confederation of hundreds of states across Central Europe, became the epicenter of this tension. Its emperor was Catholic, but many of its princes were Protestant. Each state guarded its autonomy fiercely. Beneath the surface, resentment grew. Religious coexistence was fragile, enforced by uneasy treaties rather than genuine peace. By the early 1600s, paranoia replaced diplomacy. Catholic rulers feared Protestant uprisings. Protestants feared Catholic repression. Alliances formed not out of trust, but out of mutual fear. Everyone was watching everyone else, and waiting. The spark came in Bohemia, a kingdom within the Holy Roman Empire. The Bohemian nobles were largely Protestant and deeply suspicious of their Catholic king, Ferdinand II. When Ferdinand attempted to limit their religious freedoms, they responded not with petitions, but with violence. In 1618, they stormed Prague Castle and threw 2 imperial officials out of a window. The men survived the fall, but Europe did not survive the consequences. This act, known as the Defenestration of Prague, was more than a rebellion. It was a declaration that compromise was over. Bohemia revolted. Ferdinand called in imperial forces. Neighboring powers began choosing sides. What should have been a local conflict metastasized into a continental war. Armies began to march across Central Europe. Cities were fortified. Fields were burned. Soldiers were not just fighters. They were predators, living off the land, looting villages, spreading disease, and terrorizing civilians. Warfare in the 17th century was not clean or disciplined. It was brutal, chaotic, and deeply personal. At first, the war appeared to be religious. Catholics versus Protestants. But beneath that narrative, something darker was unfolding. Kings were not fighting for God. They were fighting for territory, influence, and survival. Religion became the banner. Power was the prize. Spain supported the Catholic Habsburg dynasty to maintain its dominance in Europe. Austria sought to consolidate imperial authority. Protestant states fought not only to defend their faith, but to preserve their independence. France, a Catholic nation, would later side with Protestants simply to weaken its Habsburg rivals. This was not a war with clear heroes or villains. It was a machine that fed on fear and ambition, pulling more nations into its gravity with each passing year. By the early 1620s, Central Europe had become a battlefield without borders. Armies crisscrossed Germany, leaving behind famine, plague, and ruined towns. Civilians starved as crops were destroyed. Entire regions were depopulated. Children grew up surrounded by violence, knowing no world except war. What began as a struggle for religious rights in Bohemia had become a nightmare that no one could control, a war that would not end for 30 long years. And Europe had only just begun to bleed. As the war expanded, it consumed new nations and new ambitions. What began as a Bohemian rebellion evolved into a continental struggle for supremacy. Each phase of the war brought new players, new betrayals, and new horrors. Denmark entered the conflict in 1625, led by King Christian IV, a Protestant ruler who saw an opportunity to expand his influence in northern Germany. His intervention turned the war from a German civil conflict into a European power struggle. But Denmark underestimated the strength of the Catholic forces. Imperial armies, commanded by ruthless and brilliant generals like Albrecht von Wallenstein, crushed the Danish campaign. By 1629, Denmark was defeated and forced into retreat. But the war did not end. It merely changed shape. In 1630, Sweden entered the battlefield. Its king, Gustavus Adolphus, was young, bold, and a military visionary. He transformed warfare with fast-moving artillery, disciplined infantry, and coordinated tactics that revolutionized European battlefields. His arrival gave new hope to the Protestant cause. Gustavus Adolphus was not just a king, he was a symbol. He framed his campaign as a defense of Protestant freedom, but Sweden also sought to dominate the Baltic region. Once again, faith and ambition marched side by side. The Swedish army cut through imperial forces with shocking efficiency. Cities fell. Catholic dominance wavered. But in 1632, at the Battle of Lutzen, Gustavus was killed in combat. His death stunned Europe. Sweden continued fighting, but the war lost one of its few figures who inspired genuine loyalty rather than fear. As the war dragged on, alliances shifted constantly. Yesterday's enemy became today's ally. Principles dissolved under the pressure of survival. France, though Catholic, entered the war against the Catholic Habsburgs simply to prevent them from becoming too powerful. This moment shattered the illusion that the war was purely religious. It was now openly a geopolitical struggle. France's involvement escalated the conflict to unprecedented levels. Battles grew larger. Armies grew more professional and more destructive. The war expanded westward, drawing in Spain, the Dutch Republic, and countless smaller states. For civilians, the war was held without mercy. Soldiers looted homes, destroyed churches, and terrorized villages. Disease followed armies like a shadow. Typhus, plague, and dysentery killed far more people than swords ever could. In some regions, populations fell by more than half. Families were uprooted. Children were orphaned. Entire cultures disappeared from maps and memory. The war was no longer about winning. It was about enduring. By the 1640s, exhaustion gripped Europe. Rulers were bankrupt. Armies were mutinous. Cities were ruins. The original causes of the war were barely remembered, buried beneath decades of bloodshed. Yet the fighting continued, because no one could afford to lose. The war had become self-sustaining, a system that fed on chaos. Armies existed because war existed, and war existed because armies needed purpose. Generals grew powerful. Mercenaries roamed freely. Loyalty was purchased, not earned. The economy of Europe collapsed under the weight of endless mobilization. Taxes crushed the poor. Inflation skyrocketed. Trade routes were severed. Even neutral states suffered as refugees flooded their borders and commerce vanished. The psychological cost was even greater. A generation grew up knowing only violence. Trust dissolved. Faith itself was shaken as people questioned how a just God could allow such suffering. The political landscape transformed. Monarchs gained power by centralizing authority to wage war, weakening the traditional independence of cities and nobles. The modern nation-state was being born, not through philosophy, but through fire. Peace talks began as early as the 1640s, but negotiations were slow and fragile. Dozens of delegations gathered in the German cities of Munster and Osnabrück. They represented competing interests, ancient grudges, and fragile egos. Every clause was contested. Every compromise felt like betrayal. Meanwhile, the fighting continued. Only in 1648, after 30 years of devastation, did the war finally end with the Peace of Westphalia. The treaties reshaped Europe. Borders were redrawn. New nations were recognized. The authority of the Holy Roman Emperor was permanently weakened. The idea that kings ruled solely by divine right was quietly replaced with the concept of state sovereignty. Each nation would now rule its own territory without external interference. This principle became the foundation of modern international relations. But peace came at a terrible price. Between 4 and 8 million people had died. Entire regions were empty. Economies were shattered. The trauma would echo for generations. The 30 Years' War did not just change Europe's borders. It changed how humans understood power, religion, and war itself. When the guns finally began to fall silent, Europe did not feel peace. It felt numb. After 30 years of uninterrupted violence, entire societies have forgotten what normal life looked like. Villages stood abandoned, their wooden homes collapsing into weeds. Churches rang their bells not for celebration, but for mass funerals. Fields once green with crops were now empty, because there was no one left to harvest them. The war had not simply killed people, it had erased communities. The social fabric of Europe was torn beyond recognition. Millions of civilians have been displaced, forced to wander as refugees through unfamiliar lands. Families were broken apart, children orphaned, traditions lost. People who survived were not the same people who had entered the war decades earlier. They were harder, quieter, more cautious, and deeply scarred. Faith itself had been shaken. The war that claimed to defend God had destroyed his churches, burned his cities, and slaughtered his followers. Many no longer trusted religious authority the way they once had. This did not mean religion vanished, but it lost its absolute power over politics. Rulers had learned that holy justification did not feed armies, heal wounded soldiers, or rebuild destroyed economies. Out of this exhaustion emerged something new. States began to think less like divine missions and more like political systems. Power became centralized. Governments grew stronger, more organized, more bureaucratic. Standing armies replaced feudal levies. Taxes became permanent. Borders became meaningful. The concept of a modern state, one that exists independent of religion, personality, or dynasty, was being born. The Peace of Westphalia did more than end a war. It created a new political order. It established the principle that each state had sovereignty over its own territory. No emperor, no pope, no foreign ruler had the right to interfere in a nation's internal affairs. This idea seems obvious today, but in 1648, it was revolutionary. It meant that power was no longer universal or divine. It was territorial and legal. This shift changed everything. Diplomacy replaced crusades. Treaties replaced holy wars. Balance of power replaced the idea of one empire ruling all. Europe became a chessboard of nations instead of a battlefield of beliefs. But this transformation came at an unimaginable cost. Historians estimate that between 4 and 8 million people died, not only from battle, but from famine, disease, and displacement. Some regions lost over half their population. In parts of Germany, the demographic damage took over a century to recover. The war also changed how violence itself was understood. People saw clearly, for the first time on such a scale, that war did not bring glory, it brought ruin. That it did not purify society, it poisoned it. That it did not resolve hatred, it multiplied it. Artists and writers reflected this trauma. Literature turned darker. Paintings turned more realistic, showing suffering instead of heroism. The romantic image of war as noble adventure slowly died. Yet memory faded faster than scars healed. Within a few generations, new conflicts arose. New leaders promised new wars for new reasons. The lesson had been learned, and then gradually forgotten. That is the paradox of history. It warns us, but it cannot stop us. The 30 Years' War is often taught as a European conflict, but its meaning reaches far beyond Europe. It reveals patterns that appear again and again in human history. The dangerous fusion of ideology, fear, and power. Every war begins with a story of injustice, a story of threat, a story of righteousness. Leaders tell these stories to justify violence, to mobilize populations, and to silence doubt. During the 30 Years' War, that story was religion. Today it may be nationalism, security, honor, or destiny. The words change. The mechanism does not. The war shows how quickly fear can replace reason, how neighbors become enemies, how differences become crimes, and how ordinary people, who want nothing more than safety, are pulled into storms they did not create and cannot control. It also shows how war feeds itself. Once violence begins, it creates new interests. Armies need pay. Generals need victories. Politicians need justification. Economies adapt to conflict. Peace becomes inconvenient. War becomes normal. This is how 30 years of destruction became possible. The war also reminds us that civilians always pay the highest price. Not kings, not generals, not ministers, but farmers whose crops are burned, children whose parents are killed, women whose homes are destroyed, workers whose futures vanish. History remembers dates, treaties, and battles. It rarely remembers the names of the millions who suffered, but they are the true story. The Peace of Westphalia created the world we live in today, a world of nation-states, borders, sovereignty, and international law. But it also left us with a fragile system where peace depends on balance, trust, and restraint. When that balance breaks, the system fails, and war returns. The 30 Years' War is not important because it happened long ago. It is important because it keeps happening in different forms with different flags for different reasons. Every time leaders divide people into us and them, every time ideology becomes more important than human life, every time compromise is labeled weakness, every time war is sold as necessary, we are walking the same path. History is not a straight line. It is a cycle, and the 30 Years' War stands in that cycle as a warning written in blood. It tells us that no cause is pure enough to justify the destruction of society, that no enemy is dangerous enough to justify endless violence, that no victory is worth the cost of humanity itself. And perhaps that is the most uncomfortable truth of all. Wars do not end because they are solved. They end because people are exhausted. They end because there is nothing left to burn. The 30 Years' War did not end in triumph. It ended in silence. A silence filled with graves. A silence filled with ruins. A silence filled with ghosts. And from that silence, a new world was built. A world that still carries a memory of what happens when fear governs power. A world that still struggles to choose peace over pride. A world that still stands at the same crossroads. And the question remains, not just for Europe, but for all of us. Will we learn from history, or will we repeat it? The 30 Years' War began with a window in Prague and ended by reshaping the world. It taught humanity that no belief, no crown, no empire is worth the destruction of civilization itself. And as we look at our own world today, divided, armed, and uncertain, its echo still whispers a warning through time, because history does not repeat itself, but it does remember. And now, so do we.